True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
Now, I usually like to get right into the story, but I have a little announcement to make today. We're trying a change for our TCB membership so that all members get all of our episodes, our regular weekly episodes, without ads on the premium feed and on the website. So there'll be the version with ads, there'll be the version without ads, and members will get every episode without ads.
So another reason to become a member.
Yeah, we wanted to do something extra for our members, and we considered doing more bonus episodes, but we just really don't have the time. So we're going to try this, see if people like it.
Yeah, so give us some feedback. Let us know if you like this version.
Okay, well, most people hate ads, so I'm thinking most people will like it.
Well, I would.
Should be a positive change. Should get a little bit more for your money.
Yeah, it's like you DVR something and then you fast forward through the ads.
Yeah. So as long as we're chatting here, why don't you give us a little update on the contest before we get started?
Well, I was going to say, as long as you're mentioning the changes in the TCB membership stuff, I finally have picked a winner of the beer contest. I'm going to be playing it. I'm not telling you who it is. It's going to be a surprise, but it will be played on the 19th of May, the episode that we're doing for that day.
Right, and we'll play that instead of your beer review. We're going to have that as the beer review portion. Instead
of my beer review, we're going to give the beer review from our winner.
All right, excellent.
Look forward to it.
So Maria Cruz was a perfect example of the American dream fulfilled. Growing up in the Philippines, she moved to New York in 1992, received her M.B.A. from Fordham University, and took a job as a senior credit analyst. On Palm Sunday, April 13th, 2003, Maria attended Mass at St. Malachy's Church. She stopped by her office that afternoon, excited about an appointment she had later that day for a cosmetic laser procedure. When Maria didn't show up for work that Monday or then that Tuesday, everyone agreed that this wasn't like her. She wouldn't miss work without calling. So on Wednesday, the police were called to her apartment, but there was no sign of her. It would take months before detectives would search her emails and run a check on her laser specialist, Dean Faiello, uncovering that he had a lengthy criminal history. Join us at the quiet end for The Pretender. Dean Faiello definitely had looks, he had intelligence, and he had charm. But Maria's disappearance would reveal to everyone what he lacked, and that was a conscience.
Well, and I would say he lacked a soul.
Yeah, really. Good point. Just really a garbage human being.
He's definitely a damaged person.
Yes.
So the crime occurred in New Jersey. So we have a nice New Jersey beer. I'm going with one of my favorite breweries in New Jersey, Kane Brewing Company. It's in Ocean, New Jersey. The beer is Morning Bell, and it's what's considered an American Imperial Porter, 9.2% alcohol by volume. This is a dark brown beer with a kind of a mocha-colored head. Aroma is sweet chocolate, a little bit of coffee, and when you taste it, mostly like milk chocolate, a little bit of coffee there too. This is a medium-bodied beer, very sweet. So if you have a sweet tooth, this one's for you.
All right, this is a heavy beer for the morning. It's morning here, so yikes. I'll be napping half the day.
Yeah, we'll just get through this little episode, then you can take a snooze.
Okay. All right, let's open this beer up.
Okay.
It is pretty beer.
Well, yeah, and it tastes good. One of the problems is that it's a sweet beer, and you're drinking it and enjoying it, and before you know it, you've exceeded your capacity.
Of alcohol.
Sure. So just keep in mind that it's a fairly big hitter, and sip it slowly. Savor it.
Yes.
Better that way.
All right, well, come on down to the quiet end of our home office, spare bedroom, and we'll talk about this story, which, of course, I find very interesting. That's why I chose it.
Well, yeah, the most interesting thing is this guy pretty much had it all, or could have had it all.
Could have had it all, for sure.
And he blew it.
He blew it.
So Maria Cruz was the fourth daughter in a family with 5 children. She grew up with her siblings and her parents, Rudolfo and Irinea, in the Manila area of the Philippines. Now, 70% of people in the Philippines earn their living through farming. It's the only Christian country in the Far East, and 4/5 of the people there are Roman Catholic. Maria's family was a very devoted Catholic family, and she continued to practice her Catholicism when she moved to the United States. Now, the Filipino culture differs from other Asian cultures in that marriage was more of an equal partnership, and families weren't dominated by the man of the house. Education levels were higher for women than for men, but, like Western countries, women had to struggle for equal pay for equal work. More than anything, though, Filipino culture values family, and Maria's family was indeed a very close family.
Yeah, but they also valued education. Maria had a sister who was a dentist, and her brother was an engineer. She went to college majoring in communications, and she was a top student in all of her classes. After working for a year, Maria moved to the United States. And English was the primary language in her schools, so she didn't have a language barrier to overcome. So first Maria lived in Houston, Texas, and she got a good job with Citibank. But her ambition was to work in the world capital of business, New York City. She was able to get a transfer through Citibank, and she moved in 1993 to New York. Once there, Maria began graduate school at Fordham for business administration, and she lived in a tiny apartment in a church-owned boarding house. She graduated from Fordham with honors, and she had an M.B.A. in finance and international banking. In 2001, Maria went with other Citibank employees to Barclay Capital, and she was quickly promoted to certified financial analyst. Barclay was a place that really rewarded hard work, so Maria did well there and really stood out as a leader. She was going places. She was making a 6-figure income, but she was living a modest lifestyle, and she really liked to spend her money on her family. For example, she bought an anniversary cruise for her parents to the Bahamas, and she would pay for relatives to come and visit New York. So after a serious relationship with a man named Bill Morgan, Maria was single. Bill had moved to Chicago, and they agreed to end things. Maria called Bill in Chicago, and she even offered to move there to be with him, so she was in love. But he turned her down. By then, he was with another woman, and he told Maria he planned to marry this new woman. So, of course, her heart was broken, but she was a strong person with her own life, and she was moving forward.
He didn't waste much time.
No, with this kind of thing, you have to wonder if that was already going on.
Well, yeah, for sure. And in hindsight or retrospect, he probably wasn't the guy she wanted to be with anyway.
Well, sure. That's how it usually works. She'd realize later that it was probably a good thing that happened.
Right.
Although you could also argue if she went to Chicago, she might still be alive today.
Sure. So she got her U.S. citizenship in 2002. And that May, she saw her parents and other family members at a wedding in Houston. And this would be the last time that Maria would ever see her family. Later in 2002, Maria moved from the boarding house, and she rented a luxury studio apartment. The building was a high-rise, and Maria's apartment was on the 14th floor. There was even a uniformed doorman, so this place was definitely a step up from the boarding house she used to live in.
Yeah, she was really excited about this place.
Yeah, it sounds like a nice place.
Absolutely.
In January of 2003, Maria was on the internet looking for a cosmetic surgeon in order to cure a minor condition known as black hairy tongue. This is minor. It doesn't look real great, but it's not anything horrible. It's pretty benign and it's self-limited. It's a temporary condition. So you don't have to do anything to it.
No, but I mean, I can totally understand. She's a young single woman. She wants to look her best. She doesn't want to deal with this.
Oh, sure.
Plus, you can get scrapings, but I've heard that was really painful. It's just kind of an overgrowth of the taste buds, and they're dark colored.
Yeah, that's all it is.
So it is unsightly if someone sees your tongue.
Yeah, but it's not, when you say black hairy tongue, I mean, the picture you have in your mind is really bleh.
Yeah.
And it's not quite that bad in appearance.
It isn't. I'm just saying I can totally understand why she would want to have it taken care of.
Sure.
Yeah. So this is when she made her first appointment with Dean Faiello. Dean was born in 1959, and he was the first child of Sam and Carmel Faiello. They lived with Carmel's widowed mother until Dean was 3 years old, and that's when they purchased and moved into a nice house in Madison, New York. That same year, Dean's little sister, Deborah, was born. Carmel was a stay-at-home mom, very devoted to the kids. She was petite but very outspoken, active in the PTA, and really involved in all of their school activities. It was the kind of situation where you come home from school, mom's waiting for you with a snack. Just a really nice way to grow up, I think. But Dean and Deborah were always impeccably dressed, too, as was Carmel. Even though she stayed home, Carmel always had her hair done and her nails manicured. And she also put a lot of time and effort into her home, organizing and decorating it. At Christmas time, it was kind of a showcase. She'd fill the house with candles and decorations. They'd get a real Christmas tree, of course, and she'd decorate it with homemade ornaments. But unfortunately, Dean's dad was a different story. He was a difficult man. He was actually verbally and physically abusive. Fortunately, he wasn't home a lot, but the atmosphere in the house certainly changed when he was expected home. Dean and Deborah would be lined up at the front door to greet him, and if they did everything perfectly, he still might lash out at them. There was just no winning in this type of situation. Dean would say he was taught at a young age how to make a vodka martini, and his mom would send him into the den to give his father his drink, and Dean would try and get out of there as quickly as he could. In an effort to counteract Sam's abuse, Carmel worked hard to give her children a peaceful environment, a lot of love, a lot of praise, and appreciation. She was always very proud of their accomplishments. And they did good stuff. They were good kids.
That they were. Now, by the late 60s, Dean and Deborah were spending their summers at the beach with their paternal grandfather and their grandfather's second wife. Now, they loved the beach, which had an amusement park where they ate cotton candy and rode the rides. So it was a good place. I used to go to the Jersey Shore when I was a little kid.
Yeah, it's kind of ideal.
It was fun.
Sure.
Boardwalk. It was great. Now, when Dean was 12, his parents separated. Sam moved out of the house for several weeks, but then he returned because his attorney told him he would lose the house otherwise. Now, in order to get a divorce at the time, the couple had to live apart for 18 months. So Carmel decided that she would be the one to move out with the children. And they moved back with Carmel's mother into that tiny apartment.
So in high school, Dean was an excellent student. He was actually voted most likely to succeed. And he decided that what he wanted to do was become an engineer. Dean was very charming and I'd have to say exceptionally good looking, although I hate to give him credit for anything because he's such a shitball. But he was extremely good looking, and this did give him an advantage socially. There were always groups of girls trying to get his attention and just swooning over him. But he did know from a young age that he was gay. Still, his good looks brought him more than just popularity. He was often given preferential treatment, and he learned that his appearance often gave him a free pass, even with the teachers. He graduated high school in 1977, and he went to Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York.
Now that's a big-time good school.
Yeah, it's kind of like a junior MIT, right? It's right up there almost.
Yeah, comparable to Worcester Polytech that we're quite familiar with, and it's a good school.
It is, yep.
However, once he got to college, Dean found out that he really didn't like the hard work that was needed to succeed in the engineering program. So he's away from home where his mother was always there to push and encourage him. And that was lacking now. So even though he had the intelligence to do well, he just wasn't motivated. And he lasted 5 semesters. Then he dropped out and worked various low-paying jobs. By the late 80s, he was out of the closet. Dean was just, like you said, he was this good-looking boy, so he was desired by many men, and he seemed to get by on his looks, charm, and confidence. He was HIV positive, but he remained healthy on a cocktail of preventive medications. Still, even though he had his health for the most part, he was just really floundering to make a living while he was in his 20s. He did some dancing at New York gay bars. He sold real estate for a while. He worked various construction jobs. Little of this, little of that. Eventually, he found some success as an independent carpenter and a building contractor.
Yeah, he was able to save enough money to buy a historic home in the Forest Hills neighborhood of Newark. This was a quiet and elegant community, kind of being gentrified. It was only 20 minutes outside of Manhattan, so a really good area to be in. In 1986, he purchased the home for just $170,000, and his mother and grandmother helped him come up with the down payment. His mother was even the co-signer on his mortgage. Dean was working hard during the day in his construction business, but then in the evenings and on the weekends, he still enjoyed the glamorous nightlife. He certainly had a flair for the dramatic, and he would throw over-the-top parties in this really cool house he had, this historic home. To his neighbors, he was very polite and helpful also. He was active with community events and even helped out with yard sales. The teenage girls in the neighborhood just swooned over him. It seemed like every girl had a crush on him. Actually, they would peek out their windows and watch him leave his house and just kind of giggle. So this is the kind of effect he had on people. It's kind of gives you some power. And you can understand that. You've been there with your looks.
Yeah, well, I'll dispute the looks part of it anyway.
Well, anyway, in that neighborhood, he was very popular and seemed happy there. But we know that there was a darker side to his life. He became involved in the Manhattan gay party scene, and he began to abuse alcohol and cocaine. And in many ways, this would be his downfall.
Well, it certainly didn't help him, did it?
No.
Then in 1988, Dean met Michael Hart. Michael was blond and handsome, and he was also a smart businessman. He had built a personal care salon in Greenwich Village called The Beach. He worked 16-hour days, and he closed the salon only twice per year. That was Christmas and the day of the Gay Pride Parade. His salon was successful, and he hired Dean to do some renovations. And it didn't take long for Dean and Michael to become romantically involved.
No, they made a really good-looking couple. But with Michael, Dean seemed more satisfied with his life, at least for a while. And he even gave up his promiscuous lifestyle, which was a big thing for him. He became monogamous. The two spent time in both Michael's Manhattan apartment and in Dean's house in Newark. Michael was a reformed drug dealer, and he encouraged Dean to go to rehab. So what he did is he actually poured out all of the liquor in Dean's house, and he took care of Dean, and he made sure that he went to AA meetings 2 or 3 times a week. He also took Dean out to Broadway shows and high-end restaurants. So it was a good life, where for a while maybe he didn't feel like he needed the drugs. Seems like he found some happiness with Michael.
For a while.
Yes, for years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Michael described going out with Dean as a strange experience. Everywhere they would go, Dean became the focal point of attention from both gay men and women. People stared at him as they ate dinner or watched a show. Women would breeze by to drop off their phone numbers. Could be quite disruptive. Now, Dean became frustrated by everyone's focus on his looks, and he was relieved to find happiness with Michael, who seemed to be interested in more than the superficial parts of Dean.
Yes, but this is just amazing. What Michael would say is that if they went and ate outdoors somewhere, it would kind of stop the walking traffic on the street and cause a disruption in the whole neighborhood. I know, right?
I mean,
he's cute, but
he's not that good looking.
Well, it's different in person, though, right?
Sure.
Some people just exude this kind of, I don't know. But obviously, it was something.
He did have something.
He had something.
Had that it factor.
Sure. Probably could have been a movie star. Well, he could have been pretty much anything he wanted, if he'd only had the right state of mind and everything to do it.
After Dean expressed unhappiness with running his construction business, Michael suggested that Dean attend electrolysis school, and he could come work in the beauty business. So Dean did. He got certified as a professional electrologist in 1993. He began that career by working part-time at Michael's salon, and he quickly worked his way to full-time. He was paid $100 an hour, and he had loyal clientele who loved his personality, and they were also quite pleased with his work.
Well, yeah, and I also think if you're doing something to make yourself look better, you want a good-looking person to be helping you.
I've heard that theory from you.
Yes. And besides the good looks, which I hate to keep going on and on about, he was very charming and likable, very kind to his clients, and just kind of made them feel like they were the only person, you know? Gave them that kind of attention. And of course, working alongside Michael was great because the relationship was going really well. There were some problems, though, with the other employees. I mean, many of them were jealous of Dean's relationship with the owner. So he didn't really fit in with the group of workers there. But he stayed there to be with Michael because they got along really well. Then Dean learned about laser hair removal and took some more classes. He actually used his own body for practice. So over time, he had no hair on his chest or arms, and he was feeling pretty confident about his technique. Things were really good, but then everything just fell apart when Michael developed full-blown AIDS.
So he was hospitalized. He had toxoplasmosis, cytomegalovirus, and pneumocystis carinii. Pneumocystis is a pneumonia, lung infection. Cytomegalovirus is one of those pox viruses, nasty stuff. Toxo is a fungus.
Ugh.
These aren't good things. Well, you know, your immune system is shot, so.
Yeah, these are things healthy people usually don't get, right?
Right.
Yeah. So terribly sad. This is a smart, hardworking guy in the prime of his life.
It was.
And, you know, dying of AIDS could really be lonely for a gay man, especially in the 1990s. Dean was by Michael's side, but then his parents came up from Florida and just kind of pushed Dean aside. They came to the Forest Hills house and took Michael's belongings. And Michael was really too ill at that point to say anything or do anything different. So he moved to Florida with his family, leaving Dean in New York. There were many people in their group of friends who were critical of Dean, saying that he had really abandoned Michael in his time of need. But those who knew the couple best seemed to understand what had happened, that Dean had just kind of been pushed out, so they sympathized with Dean. He was really heartbroken. Now, he might not have been the most supportive person during this time, because just thinking of how his personality was, I could see that. But I think that he did care about him, so this was a tragic time. And Michael passed away when he was in Florida. This was in November of 1995. So just a tragedy.
It was. This guy sounded like he was a help.
A good guy. Yeah, and definitely good for Dean.
Definitely. With Michael's death, the dislike for Dean in the salon escalated because Michael wasn't there to defend him any longer. And Dean's life just spiraled out of control. He went back to drugs. He went back to alcohol. Things weren't going well. Then he met Jason Opsahl. Now, Jason was a Broadway performer. When he and Dean first met, Jason was performing in Grease in the role of Kenickie, who was the leader of the guys at Rydell High. And he was romantically involved with the head of the Pink Ladies, Betty Rizzo. Now, Rosie O'Donnell played Rizzo, and the two became good friends.
Yes, she became a real help to Jason. Really impressive, the things that I read about that she did for him. And Dean and Jason became very serious very quickly. They took trips together to Orlando, Florida, and Dean got to meet Jason's parents and siblings, who were very accepting. The family even visited them in New York. When Jason needed a loan, Dean offered him the $2,000 he needed, and in exchange, Jason made Dean the beneficiary of his Actors Guild pension. The amount at the time was only about $2,000, but it would grow to be a lot more money over time. Jason was really busy as a stage actor. He was very talented, and he traveled for many of his performances. So these separations were hard on his relationship with Dean, and the way that Dean was, he was just sleeping with other men. Then, in 1997, Jason was diagnosed with brain cancer, and he was given a prognosis of just 6 months to live. So, this was a shock. Jason ended up having enormous medical expenses, and Rosie O'Donnell paid these. Jason went to be with his family in Florida, but after a year there, he actually beat the odds and was in remission. But by then, the relationship with Dean was already over. Dean was fickle.
Apparently. So they're done. Now, around this time, Dean made a change in his career. He contacted a dermatologist named Laurie Paulus and asked if he could move his practice into her medical office in Soho. Now, Dr. Paulus was a very impressive person.
Definitely. I'm impressed.
She was certified by the National Board of Medical Examiners and the American Board of Dermatology. She also had academic positions. She was a professor at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine, and she was a clinical instructor at 2 major New York hospitals. And that means that she would make rounds with the students and interns and stuff and just discuss the cases.
Yes.
So, pretty good.
Yes, a busy woman.
Very.
When she was approached by Dean, Dr. Paulus was a consultant also for several corporations, and she had completed several postdoctoral courses as well. Now, she was impressed with Dean's desire to learn, also his excellent bedside manner, and of course, his looks wouldn't hurt because this was the beauty business after all. So Dean left the beach salon and reached an agreement with Dr. Paulus. He worked in her office, and she was really happy with his performance. He was clean, put together, and well-liked by the clients. She saw him as very professional, and he was also helpful and intelligent.
So far, it's a win-win situation.
Yes, he was doing great there.
Now, this is the time that laser technology was just starting to emerge in the field of dermatology. Dr. Paulus was trained as a laser surgeon, and she was introducing the technology to her patients. Dean said he wanted to observe and learn more about her techniques, and he told Dr. Paulus that he had some experience with older laser technology, but wanted to learn about the new methods used in her practice. He said if he knew more about it, then he would know when to refer patients to her instead of performing electrolysis. So Dr. Paulus agreed and allowed him to watch procedures with the client's consent.
Yeah, so he was happy about that, and he was very helpful. She said that he even assisted patients into treatment rooms when he didn't have any clients of his own. And he did refer several of his electrolysis patients to her for laser treatments. Then he began going to marketing meetings and sharing some good ideas, just becoming part of the business.
Yeah, unfortunately, though, Dean discovered Stadol when he was working in the office. This is a opiate nasal spray, and he got addicted pretty quickly. After months of working for Dr. Paulus, he resigned, kind of abruptly. He told her that he was dying of AIDS and he was moving to Florida to be with his parents. Now, this is pretty shocking. People in the office knew that he was gay. They knew he was HIV positive, but he had always seemed fairly healthy. So the staff was pretty sad to see him go. They had a huge farewell party and gifts.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of them were heartbroken. Here's this young man telling them that he's dying. It was sad for them. But you know what? Dean had actually just stolen Michael Hart's story and used it for himself. What he actually had done was decided to set up his own practice and to steal patients for both electrolysis and laser procedures. And once on his own, he was very busy. Many of his clients were transgender women who needed full beards removed. And when they complained of the pain, that's when he started using lidocaine to numb up their faces. And then he offered reduced rates, and he started criticizing Dr. Paulus to them to try and take her clients away. So very conniving.
Very sneaky, yep.
He called his business Skin Ovations, and he worked in a dentist's office building for a few months, and then he leased an office in an Upper East Side medical complex, adjoining the office of a Dr. William Keevy.
Yeah, now Dr. Keevy was a pretty well-respected plastic and reconstructive surgeon. he wrote the lidocaine prescriptions for Dean's clients. And it's a little surprising to me that this guy was that helpful, and he never seemed to question Dean's qualifications or anything. But on the other hand, over the years, there were other medical professionals who were either taken in by his good looks and charm or were greedy enough to take payments from him.
Yeah, like kickbacks, I guess.
Right.
He wasn't in the same office as Dean, but he was listed as the medical director for Skinovations. It's not known if Dr. Keevy was aware, but Dean expanded his services to laser pigmented lesion removal, tattoo removal, and laser skin resurfacing. Since New York State had no laws requiring that a laser operator had a medical degree, performing these procedures really didn't break any laws, but we know that at this point, Dean was headed on a very dangerous path. He was not qualified for these things he was doing at all.
No, he wasn't.
He also advertised that he was a member of the American Society for Laser Medicine and Surgery, and then he even told people he was a dermatologist. He was definitely breaking the law when he wrote prescriptions for Stadol and forged Dr. Polis's name to them. When he first became addicted to this drug, it was about $100 per bottle. Then the price went up to $250, and Dean was using up to a bottle per day. He often used his own credit card to pay for this drug, so that left a paper trail for investigators to look at later.
Yeah, and he also figured out if clients would show up at his office for laser procedures, they would very often come with Stadol that their doctors had prescribed. And Dean would use it, and then he would just kind of keep the partially used bottles for himself.
Yeah, people would even call him and say, I can't find my Stadol, and he would, of course, deny it.
I don't know where it went.
Right, because, of course, the drug had a much stronger effect on them than it did on Dean, who was quite addicted.
Yeah.
High tolerance.
Very high tolerance.
So Dr. Polis was looking through New York Magazine when she saw an ad for a new laser clinic. Of course, that caught her eye.
Yeah, it's her field.
Yeah, and the marketing was very similar to that she was using for her own practice. So imagine her surprise when she saw that the director and laserist in the ad was none other than Dean Faiello. So of course she felt manipulated, tricked, and betrayed. He had pretended to be fatally ill, and what he was actually doing was using everything she'd taught him to start his own business and compete against her. Using a laser for hair removal didn't require a medical license in the state of New York, but Dean had gone over the line. He was describing himself as a medical practitioner, and he was advertising the removal of ugly brown spots and other skin lesions. And this was scary. You can't just go doing that.
Well, no.
No.
I mean, this is dangerous stuff because he's not trained. So he wouldn't know the difference, say, between a harmless sunspot and a cancerous melanoma. And if he lasered a cancerous lesion, it might not be visible any longer, but it could grow inside the body and spread unchecked. So you're opening the door for some horrible outcomes.
Absolutely.
With this.
Yeah. His website claimed that there were medical doctors on staff. So Dr. Polis called Skinovations and found out that it was just an office with a receptionist and one room with one laser machine. So Dr. Polis called the state health department, she called the police, she called the state attorney general's office, and she even called the DEA. But no one was helpful, and no one knew which legal authority would respond. It was like in this area that nobody would take responsibility for. She did talk about the issue at dermatology meetings with other physicians. And Dr. Geronimus, the director of the Laser and Skin Surgery Center of New York, told Dr. Polis that he had some concerns about Dean Faiello as well. He was familiar. He knew his work. He'd actually had several patients coming into his office complaining about scarring over areas that Dean had treated. And these weren't fixable. The damaging treatments were from tattoo, lesion, and even hair removal. So Dr. Geronimus had checked into it, and he learned that Dean Faiello, of course, didn't have a medical license.
Yeah, so his point was simply this: you must have training in the presenting problem as well as the device you're using. And without education in clinical judgment, the operator doesn't know what he's dealing with or how the laser will react with the skin. So Dr. Geronimus filed a complaint about Dean's unlicensed practice with the Office of Professional Discipline at the State Department of Education.
As all this was going on, Dean met an event planner named Greg Bach, and these two began a romantic relationship. Greg had been an internationally ranked swimmer who'd moved to New York in 1984 to study art and design. He was an artist, creating sculptures in the sand on beaches of Fire Island in East Hampton. What he would do is take photos of his sculptures as the tide came in and they collapsed. His sand sculpting actually led him to meeting an event designer who hired him as a freelance artist. And eventually he got a full-time position in the floral department. He'd really found his niche. He was branching out onto his own when he and Dean got together. Greg had actually noticed Dean years ago when they were still in their 20s, and he just thought he was breathtaking. He had a big crush from the beginning. When he met him again at a bar that he frequented, Greg approached Dean, and they spent hours together talking and hanging out, and then the next day, Greg was just over the moon because Dean sent him a dozen roses, and this was his dream man. So Greg left a lawyer he'd been involved with to be with Dean exclusively. Soon they were splitting their time, staying together at Greg's Midtown apartment and Dean's home in Forest Hill, and they spent weeknights in Manhattan and weekdays at Dean's house. In the late 90s, Dean was getting near 40 years old, and he backed off of the partying, and he and Greg shared a quiet domestic life for a while. They were both open with their families about their relationship, and everything seemed very good. Everything seemed good.
Well, yeah, it looks like he's settled down and found someone to be with, share his life with. This sounds good, except for the little fact of his illegal medical practice.
Sure, but I think it's more than that. I think he treated people horribly. I mean, I think he knew how crazy about him Greg was and all that Greg was doing for him, and he took advantage. And maybe he knew no other way of life, I don't know. But he was just so horrible to people in the end.
Yeah, he was.
It's all about
But at
Dean.
the same time, they would forgive him.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Now, there finally came a day when Dr. Paulus received a notice from a health insurance company. She was a participating physician in this plan. The insurance company wanted to know why she had written so many Stadol prescriptions for Dean Faiello. She said, "I'm not even familiar with this drug." And she said to the insurance company, "Send the copies of the prescriptions to her, because they were not written by her."
No, it turned out they were written on an old pad that she had put in the office shredding bin a while back, and she thought they'd been destroyed. The signature didn't look anything like hers, and she knew that Dean had forged them. So now that Dean had definitely, straightforwardly, obviously broken the law, the DEA was interested in investigating, and Dr. Paulus filed a report of Dean's forgery and theft.
Serious.
Yeah, now he's in trouble.
He is. And it's not something he's going to be able to talk his way out of.
No, I don't think that the DEA is going to care what he looks like.
So and there's a former employee of Dr. Paulus's practice, and she was able to confirm with investigators that Dean had stolen prescription pads from the clinic before he resigned. So Dean was arrested. He was charged with possession of a controlled substance, forgery, and possession of a forged instrument. So Dean responded to this by disappearing for 3 days, and he was basically incommunicado. He did finally call Greg.
But Greg was beside himself worried.
Yeah, and he hadn't heard anything.
No, but it turns out Dean was at his sister Deborah's house. His father had paid his bail to get him out of jail. Then that November, Dean pled guilty to the lesser charge of possession of a forged instrument, which was a misdemeanor. So he really got off easy here. He was sentenced to probation for just 3 months, and he had to go to drug rehab. For rehab, he spent 6 weeks in a clinic in upstate New York. And Greg, of course, waited for him and was very supportive. He was in love with Dean and wanted to help him in any way he could. And when Dean got home, he threw a lavish Christmas Eve party for both of their families, and Greg knew how to throw a party. The house was decorated just beautifully, but Skinovations didn't permanently close. Dean returned with an $8,000 loan from Greg to keep him afloat. Dean seemed committed to abstaining from alcohol and drugs at this point, and he worked hard 6 days a week to bring in more money so he could pay Greg. And he faithfully did pay Greg $600 a week toward what he owed him.
Now, his electrolysis license had lapsed in late 1998, because in order to continue to be licensed, you have to have continuing education credits, which he had none. The lapse of his license, though, had no legal significance. When he was arrested for forgery, this had set off an investigation into his claims to be a medical professional and performance of procedures he wasn't qualified to do. So we're investigating that now. And on December 23rd, 1998, an undercover officer from the Office of Professional Discipline made an appointment with Dean.
Yeah, so the officer, Kathy Hearn, went to Dean's office and showed him a dark spot, and he quickly diagnosed it as benign. He offered to remove this lesion with laser treatments, and he said he first would inject an anesthetic so she wouldn't feel any pain. So first of all, Dean had no training to tell her that this lesion was benign, and second, he wasn't qualified to be injecting lidocaine. So Kathy Hearn filed a report, and the case was referred to the Attorney General. But the AG wanted more evidence before they would pursue prosecution. So what they did was they encouraged Hearn to just continue investigating.
Yeah, and then in early 1999, Dean's mother, Carmel, was diagnosed with metastatic cancer that was inoperable. So Dean went to visit her at his sister Deborah's house, and he was upset to learn that Carmel was only getting holistic treatment for her pain. Deborah and her partner just didn't want Carmel to take narcotics or sleeping pills. So Dean went ahead and crushed pain pills and sleeping pills into Carmel's food. He called Greg, and Greg said, "This is dangerous stuff, don't do it." Because he had no idea how much of the drugs to give and how they would interact with his mother's other medications. But, getting criticized by Greg just pissed Dean off, so he solved that by hanging up on Greg.
Yeah, well, Dean was falling back into his addictions at this point.
Well, sure, with these drugs available
right.
for his mother.
Sure. Yeah. But Greg didn't speak up right away because he was sympathetic about Dean's mother's illness. So, in an effort to distract Dean and keep him busy, Greg began renovations on Dean's house, because this house needed a lot of work. Greg landscaped the yard and upgraded much of the interior of the house at his own expense. But still he was unable to rein in Dean. Dean was a loose cannon again. Then after his mom died in August of 1999, just before Dean's 40th birthday, he fell even deeper into his addiction. He began missing work and just sleeping the days away. But Greg was loyal to Dean, and he was genuinely worried about him. He brought in a mutual friend, and they convinced Dean to attend outpatient rehab. And he agreed, and it seemed to work, but only for a short time. So understandably, Greg was expecting Dean to inherit some money from his mother, and he hoped it would help with their financial stress. But Deborah inherited everything, and Greg was really upset to hear this. Until he learned that Dean had received his inheritance in advance and hadn't told him about it. Because before Carmel died, Dean applied for several credit cards in her name, and he went out and maxed them out. And when the bills started to come in, Deborah learned about this fraud, and she had to pay thousands of dollars from their mother's savings to pay off the credit card debt. So he wasn't above stealing from his dying mother. Yeah. It gives you some idea of what a shitball he was.
He's not a good guy.
No, he just doesn't give a fuck about anyone but himself, really, when it comes down to it. It's all about him. Just a real narcissist.
Now, he was also sued by a former patient around this time. The patient claimed that the laser hair removal treatments to his back were useless and that Dean had made false promises. So it was certainly known that the laser was less effective in hair on the torso than on the lower body. So it's not certain if the technology was ineffective or if Dean's technique was at fault. But in the end, Dean settled with the patient for $3,200.
Yeah, there were quite a few people who had paid him thousands of dollars and hadn't gotten the results. And I'm not sure, maybe if it wasn't effective, he shouldn't have been doing that and they should have been getting electrolysis. But I think he liked to just have them keep coming back and taking their money.
Well, sure.
And he was back into drugs and began working less and less. And the more he stayed home, of course, the bigger the financial stress became. So by 2001, his mortgage payments were just months overdue, and he was in serious danger of foreclosure. Once again, Greg came to his rescue. He loaned Dean another $7,000 with an agreement that they would rent out the third floor of the house, and the rent payments would go to Greg. So Greg had pretty much become Dean's caretaker. Dean stayed in his apartment during the week, and Greg would wake him up for work each day. If Greg was away, Dean would just sleep all day and miss work. Deborah was really concerned for her brother, too, so she had him at her house over the weekends. And when Greg was away, she would call Dean to get him out of bed. So she'd go to work and she'd have to call home to make sure he got out of bed for work. So it's really ridiculous. Very enabling behavior.
Certainly was.
Greg and Deborah started calling what they did for Dean their babysitting service, which was pretty accurate.
So time passes. Greg and Dean's relationship continues to really deteriorate. Greg no longer took responsibility for Dean getting to work, and Dean stopped paying Greg payments. Dean ended up renting an apartment in the city, which he couldn't afford, and he stopped staying with Greg.
Then once again, Dr. Polis came across an ad in New York Magazine for Skin Ovations. She was really dismayed to see that Dean was still offering the same services and he had a new office. Dean's probation was over with in January 2002, so he thought he was in the clear. But investigations of him were very active still. Another undercover officer visited Dean in his office, and Dean offered to remove blood vessels from her legs, and he also diagnosed a skin lesion as benign. He told her he'd use a laser and he'd give her lidocaine to numb the areas. She even asked him if he was a doctor, and he assured her that he was. A second round of reports then were sent to the Attorney General. Surely this should be enough. Let's do something about this guy, right?
Right.
But it didn't happen. He moved his practice to a new space that summer, and this property was owned by Dean's personal doctor, Dr. Lawrence Fontana. He worked there under the supervision of an adult primary doctor specializing in treating HIV-positive patients, and this was Dr. Frank Spinelli.
The complaints about Dean's practice brought in a couple journalists because they were going to write an expose. Barbara Nevins-Taylor, who's a reporter from a local TV news station, had been focusing on the cosmetic surgery industry, and she found several practitioners who were doing dangerous procedures and botching them. One physician she was looking into was a guy named Dr. Jose Lopez. He had a young mother die on his operating table from anesthesia he had given her during a tummy tuck. Now, women who did survive Lopez's surgeries had these horrible stories to tell of scarring, wounds, and infections. But it sounds like the case we did not too long ago.
Yeah, right. It is similar. But I just think if you don't have an anesthesiologist, that's a problem. You don't just go in and have surgery with a doctor and an untrained person.
If you're having surgery done that's going to require an anesthetic, more than just maybe some local stuff, yeah, you absolutely have to have an anesthesiologist. It'd be a good idea anyway.
I'm weary of the whole thing. I just would prefer to be in a hospital where there's everything there, because you never know what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Lopez's medical credentials were revoked, but then he went ahead and opened a new surgery center. So Barbara, the journalist, barged into his office with the cameraman and caught him performing surgery. After they called the police, Lopez actually ran out of the building and then just denied doing the surgery, even though they had him on film doing it.
Yeah.
He took off to Florida, where he just began doing it again, picked right up where he left off. Finally, he pled guilty to practicing medicine without a license, and he was sentenced to 2 to 6 years in prison. But he hurt a lot of people before that happened.
He did. Barbara's focus then expanded to the use of laser technology by non-medical professionals. The TV station set up a hotline and received calls with complaints about Dean Faiello. He was telling clients that he was a physician, which he wasn't. Barbara contacted Dr. Polis, who told her Dean's history, and agreed that he was a threat to public health. In August 2002, Linda Sachs, a TV news producer, made an appointment with Dean. She had a hidden camera, and she taped Dean saying that he was a doctor.
Yeah, and Barbara Nevins made another appointment with Dean with a hidden camera, and he told her that he could use the laser to remove her moles or lesions. He also said he could remove her spider veins. Barbara came right out and asked Dean on camera if he was a doctor, and he said, Barbara also noticed that Dean seemed to be on drugs. He wasn't normal. He was talking slowly and seemed kind of out of it. So he was really deep into his addiction at this point. And when she asked about his credentials, he told her he had graduated from the University of Medicine and Dentistry in New Jersey. A total lie. Of course, he never even got his undergraduate degree.
No, he quit.
Yep.
Now, the story about Dean broke on the news on Friday, October 4th, and the hidden camera video was shown. The New York Post then printed the story that Sunday, and they included a quote from Dr. Polis. Having a laser in your hand is like having a gun. You have to know what you're doing. And the headline for the article was, "He'll make your skin crawl."
I love it.
Yeah, it's an apt title.
Isn't it? That's great. I wish they hadn't used it. We could have used it for this episode.
I know, too bad. So after reading this article, Dean's sister Deborah went to his house to help him. And seeing that Dean was in the paper, this was very difficult for Deborah. She was pretty law-abiding. She had graduated from Rutgers and had become a New Jersey state trooper. Then she became a K-9 unit dog handler. She had a German Shepherd who was trained in drug and bomb detection, and she's thinking, oh, maybe I should have brought the dog with her to Dean's house. It's not a bad idea.
Well, you would think every time Dean visited, the dog would run over and bark at him.
Yeah.
Because he had to have the smell of drugs on him, right?
Yeah.
So Greg was still in there, though, helping him out, and he paid a $7,500 retainer to hire a defense attorney for Dean. And with his attorney, Dean turned himself in to the Attorney General's office in Manhattan. He was arraigned on 3 charges of unlicensed practice of medicine, and he also faced an assault charge for removing a woman's tattoo and leaving her horribly scarred. Dean was given bail of $5,000 with the condition that he not treat any patients, even for hair removal. Now, Dean's father had an idea. He thought it would be best to just leave Dean in jail, let him learn a lesson. But Greg was just horrified by the idea. He couldn't do it. He got a cash advance on a credit card, and he paid Dean's bail. So Dean was home the same day, didn't even have to spend a night in jail, thanks to Greg.
Now, the following day, Greg thought that Dean was going to close the office.
Close it up for good.
For good. Not true.
No.
So officers from the Professional Discipline Board visited Dr. Andrew Rayner and asked him about his relationship with Dean. He said they were friends, and that he had been a client of Dean's. He denied getting any money from Skinnovations, but investigators found canceled checks to Rayner from Dean, and Dean's website had Dr. Rayner named as the medical director for the practice, but Rayner said that wasn't authorized by him. Then he was shown prescriptions for evidence that he was prescribing Dean's patients, and he said, oh, those are forgeries. And he was asked to give a sample of his writing, but then he appeared to be deliberately changing his handwriting, so he's reported also to the State Department of Health.
And Greg believed that he had convinced Dean to stop seeing clients. I mean, if you had common sense, you would by now, right?
One would think.
So he visited an accountant, and Dean agreed to sell the house to reduce the financial burden. Greg agreed to pay all of Dean's bills until he went to serve his jail sentence. So Dean granted his power of attorney to Deborah, though. But Greg was okay with that because he trusted Deborah at this point. He got along with her, and he believed that she would reimburse him all the money that he had been giving to Dean after the house was sold. So Greg worked hard to improve this house for sale, with the plan to liquidate Dean's assets so he'd have a nest egg to start over with after he served his jail time. The house did need repairs, and again, Greg was using his own money to make them. Greg had neighbors over for home improvement parties and potluck dinners. And he spent thousands more dollars that he really didn't have, and neighbors came and volunteered to help out. Mark Ritchie, who lived down the block, worked harder than anyone, every evening and even on the weekends. And Greg believed he was doing it out of kindness. But actually, Dean was paying him behind Greg's back with money that he was earning by seeing clients, when Greg thought he wasn't doing that anymore.
Now, the house quickly sold, pretty close to the asking price. Greg was willing to pay for some repairs that were conditions of the sale. And he asked Dean for a lien on the house so he'd get compensated after the mortgage was paid off. Dean and Deborah refused. Dean convinced Greg that a lien would just complicate things. So in the end, Greg settled for a promissory note written through an attorney. And a grand jury issued a 20-count indictment against Dean. His lawyer was able to make a deal for a maximum sentence of 6 months in jail, under the condition that Dean cooperate in an investigation of physicians.
So meanwhile, at this time, Jason Opsel's cancer recurred, and he died in surgery. Remember, he had brain cancer.
Right.
And remember, Dean was the beneficiary of his pension account. But by this time, it was worth close to $100,000. And Dean wasn't even in a relationship with Jason.
Not for a long time.
Right.
I mean, nobody had ever, back in the day, thought to change the pension amount, change it back to family members instead of payable to Dean.
Right. The paperwork wasn't done, but Jason did make it clear in writing before he died that he wanted his brother's children to get that money, that Dean could have the $2,000, or even some with interest, but most of it was supposed to go to his brother's kids, which is very reasonable. Jason's brother called Dean, and Dean agreed over the phone that the children should of course inherit the money, and he said that he would do whatever was needed to get the money to them. But of course he never followed through. He kept that money for himself, and Jason's brother filed a lawsuit. Then in December, Dean pled guilty to 17 misdemeanors and received a 6-month sentence. After the creditors were paid and Greg was reimbursed, Dean would still have $150,000 when he got out of jail. But Greg was really becoming frustrated with Dean. He was continuing to support him, but Dean wouldn't lift a finger to help himself or anybody.
Now, a friend of Dean's named Patty Rosato spent a lot of time with him after his arrest, and she learned that Dean had paid a friend for the use of an apartment on 16th Street, and she believed that Dean had reopened Skinovations. The doctors who had given Dean prescriptions for Stadol were themselves being investigated, and Dean had begun buying whatever drugs he could from dealers in order to feed his habit, and this cost money, obviously. So even though Greg was paying all of Dean's bills, Dean still needed money.
Maria Cruz had her 35th birthday on March 9, 2003, and she spoke to her family in the Philippines and talked with her brother June about his trip to see her in New York coming up that April. They were excited about their plans together, of course. And shortly after her birthday, Maria sent an email to Dean Faiello. She told him that she'd had some dizziness and nausea after her last laser treatment for black tongue that he had done, and Dean wrote back to her offering some over-the-counter treatments she could try. He agreed to meet with her on Sunday evening, April 13th, for another treatment. And it was really convenient to Maria that Dean could see her outside of regular office hours, and his personality really put her at ease. She was a busy professional, and even as smart and business-minded as she was, she had fallen for his charm, and she believed his false credentials. Just before the visit that Sunday, Dean emailed Maria, and he wrote that he needed to pick up some lidocaine and syringes and asked that she bring $400 in cash with her instead of paying by check like she normally did. Apparently this didn't concern her, and she did agree to do that. So she went to Sunday Mass, did some preparations for a Monday morning work meeting, and then withdrew the $400 from an ATM. She did a little bit of shopping and then arrived at the 16th Street apartment to meet with Dean Faiello. So like you said, Dick, her condition, black tongue, was very minor and temporary, and usually a physician could do a series of tongue scrapings and even just recommend brushing the tongue at home. But Maria decided to get laser treatment. It was less painful than scraping, and she could afford it, so why not? And even if all had gone well, she was taking a risk because only a physician would be able to differentiate between black tongue and this other serious condition I read about called hairy leukoplakia.
Leukoplakia.
And tell me about that.
It's a precancerous growth. It involves white blood cells.
Yeah, so if that's what she had.
If she had that, his laser treatment's going to hide the condition, and that would allow it to become cancerous and spread undetected. So, not a good thing.
Right. Prior to using his laser, Dean injected lidocaine into Maria's tongue, and this is a local anesthetic, but too high of a dose can certainly cause serious problems. I would think especially in the tongue, right?
Well, you're starting to inject things into the tongue. That's a very vascular organ, so it will quickly get absorbed and potentially cause some problems. So remember, this guy doesn't have any true medical training. Everything he knows to do, he's learned kind of by osmosis or bluffing.
Sure.
Who knows if he even gave appropriate amounts? I mean, he should have known you got to be very careful with the tongue in terms of how vascular it is. He should have known how much lidocaine to give. But he probably gave too much of a dose.
Well, after the injection, she'd had some ringing in her ears and became lightheaded. Then her face became flush. And Dean didn't know there was a problem until she began to have some convulsions.
Yeah, that'll do it. That'll get your attention.
Yes, scary.
Now, and she might have had some complications from the lidocaine that might cause some heart rhythm problems. It's just not a good thing to do. And she could have been given some medication to stop the seizure, but Dean wouldn't have any idea what meds to use. He wouldn't have had them anyway. So what does he do? Here's this woman who's unconscious or barely conscious having seizures. So he called his friend Patty Rosato, and Patty called Dr. David Goldschmidt. This is a friend who was the emergency room director at NYU Downtown Hospital. Patty asked David if she could give Dean his number. Then she called Dean back and gave him the number. So how much time did this waste?
Enough for her to die.
Yeah.
Right? This is a crucial thing that she could die in a couple of minutes. And they're calling back and forth. What kind of bullshit is that?
Yeah, I know.
I mean, Dean, all right, he's messed up on drugs and he doesn't care about people anyway. What's Patty's excuse?
Well, I would hope it's just that she's trying to help somebody out.
Yeah, but that's not the way to do it. You immediately call 911. Come on.
Yeah, well, that's what the ER doc told him to do.
Yes.
But, we've wasted valuable time here.
Well, plus he was kind of downplaying it, right?
Mm-hmm.
He called the doctor and explained the emergency to him, claiming that the convulsing woman was just a friend. So he's not saying this was a client or that he did anything. David told him to call 911 immediately. And Dean said, she's regaining consciousness and I'll ask her if she wants to go to the hospital. But Dr. Goldschmidt was just like, no, call 911 right away. This is life-threatening. That's not what Dean wanted to hear. He hung up on him. And this was the time where he would make a crucial decision. And he made the wrong one. He put his own best interests above Maria's life. If he took her to the hospital, he would have been exposed and he would have been in more trouble. And if she survived, she would have given his name. So again, it's all about what's best for Dean.
Right. And this ER doctor, Goldschmidt, wanted to call an ambulance. But all he knew was that the woman was in a Manhattan apartment. He had no idea where it was. He tried calling back by using *69, but the number was blocked. And he was worried that Dean didn't realize how serious the situation was. Well, he's certainly correct in that concern.
Yes.
So Maria's seizures did stop, but she wasn't breathing, and she had no pulse. Despite this, Dean called his friend, who was an accountant, and asked for his advice. The friend said, call 911 right away. And Dean said, well, I'm going to take her to St. Vincent's Hospital because that's only 4 blocks away. But he never did that.
No, he thought about himself, about what would happen to him if he did the right thing. He realized that his plea agreement would fall apart if it was found out that he was treating patients. So what he did, and this is unforgivable and shocking, he put Maria's tiny 4'10", 90-pound body into a suitcase and rolled her out to his car. Then he drove to his Newark home via the Holland Tunnel. And the following day, Monday, Maria's co-workers were concerned she didn't show up for work. She'd never missed work without calling. People were calling her apartment from the office but not getting an answer, and this was just totally out of character. Then Tuesday came, Maria didn't come to work again. Martin Davey, who worked at Barclay with her, went to the boarding house where she used to live, and he learned that Maria had moved out a few months earlier. So he went back to the office, checked with Human Resources, and got her new address.
Then another co-worker, Mike Regan, who lived near her new apartment building, checked in on the building and on Maria Wednesday morning. When he got to the door, he saw 3 issues of the Wall Street Journal lying on the floor. He rang the doorbell, he knocked, nobody answered. So Maria's supervisor called her emergency contact, which was her Aunt Rebecca, and she lived in Jersey City. Now Rebecca was immediately alarmed. She knew that Maria had a strong work ethic and was always a responsible person. She called her nephew and her nephew's brothers, and they all went to Maria's apartment. Now, the building manager wouldn't let them into the apartment without the police. So they went to the local NYPD office and went back with 2 female officers. They forced the door open. There was no sign of foul play. Her passport was there, other papers were there. Her purse and sneakers weren't there.
Dean Faiello was at his house in Newark, and he was working with large quantities of concrete. Greg Bach and neighbor Mark Ritchie had both bought several bags for him at the Home Depot. And Greg knew that they needed some concrete for home repairs, but this was too much, and he was afraid they were going to have excess. And he really didn't look forward to finding a place to get rid of these extra bags of concrete before the new owners came to do their inspection, because this was pretty much the day before the closing.
Yeah. What's going on with this last-minute stuff here, you know?
And Dean normally didn't work.
Yeah.
Right?
That was a foreign object.
Yeah.
So Dr. Goldschmidt, this guy's pretty cool. He's still kind of on the case.
Well, wouldn't you be worried?
Well, yeah, but you've been telling us about all these scumbag doctors who are interested in just making money.
Well, yeah, but I mean, of course, the majority of doctors aren't that way.
But here we got this guy.
Sure.
And he finally tracked Dean down, and he asked him about his friend who had been having the convulsions. And Dean said, well, they stopped and she was fine. Then when his other friend, the accountant, asked him about her, he told that guy that he had taken her to St. Vincent's and she was doing well.
Maria's sister Tess, Laura, and her brother June landed at JFK on April 18th, and they expected Maria to be there to pick them up. Of course, they were tired from that long flight, and they were looking forward to spending time with her. So they waited there for nearly 2 hours before calling other family members who lived nearby. That's when June and Tess learned that Maria had been missing for 5 days. Family members had been calling hospitals and looking for her. They'd wanted to file a missing persons report, but apparently the police had told them to hold off for a week to see if she turned up. Maria's brother and sister went to the NYPD station to file a missing persons report, and they were able to convince an officer that this wasn't just some ordinary case of somebody taking off. This wasn't in Maria's character, and they knew something was seriously wrong. Detective Joseph De La Roca went with Tess, June, and Maria's uncle Jose to Maria's apartment. There were no signs of a break-in or a struggle, but things did seem off. I mean, there were dishes in the sink and grapes on the counter. So they knew that if she'd left on her own, she hadn't planned on being away for long at all. She was a fairly neat person.
Now, meanwhile, Dean is preparing his home for the buyers. Remember, it's been sold.
Yep.
And he's been doing all this work, or Greg's been doing all this work.
Yeah, they're coming upon the closing at this point.
Right, and Dean's pouring the concrete. So Greg's moving junk around, putting it into a dumpster. And that afternoon, he saw Dean working in the carriage house. The lower level was used as a garage, but this was now filled with boxes and furniture that was stacked all the way up to the ceiling. and Dean was filling a large plastic tub with bags of Quikrete. Greg asked him what he was doing, and Dean said, I'm fixing the plumbing. This didn't make sense at all. But Greg walked away, not wanting to start an argument with Dean. Dean hadn't been working very much at the house until that very day. He had preferred to hire people, or even better, manipulate people into doing the work for him.
Right, so Dean had mixed the concrete and poured it like a platform in a storage closet in the back. And then he put a suitcase wrapped in garbage bags into the wet concrete. He pushed it in and covered it with more concrete. About 4 p.m., Greg went back to the carriage house and saw Dean smoothing the top with a trowel. And he offered to help, but Dean was very hostile and told him to leave him alone. Then the next day they had the closing on the purchase of the house, and Dean wasn't getting along with Greg, no surprise. So he moved into a third-floor apartment in Mark Ritchie's house, just 2 blocks away. And I think Mark had a little crush on Dean at that point, too.
Everybody did.
Yeah.
Now, Maria's family members are actively searching for Maria. They're calling newspapers, TV stations. They posted flyers in Queens, Manhattan, and New Jersey. They created a website, and they posted information about her disappearance.
And Deborah, of course, was handling Dean's finances. She sent a $10,000 check to Greg after the closing, but Dean still owed him another $85,000 that he had paid out for Dean's legal costs, for mortgage payments, and for all those home repairs. But now Deborah kind of turned on Greg, and she questioned his claims about what Dean owed him, which was a real slap in the face, because Greg had gone so out of his way to help Dean.
Repeatedly.
Yeah.
And he claimed that he had a pretty good relationship with Deborah.
Yeah, he thought he did. So what he did was he gathered the documents as proof to send to her, but then she forwarded them to an attorney. So she's trying to get Dean out of it.
Not a good sign.
No. And after Dean moved in with Mark, he was just the worst house guest ever. He was doing drugs every night, sleeping all day. He started stealing things, even wearing Mark's clothing. Now, Mark worked hard. He was a hairstylist, and when he got home, he'd find the air conditioning running full blast, and his electric bill tripled. And even though he asked Dean to cut it out, he just continued, showed no consideration. So it didn't take long before Mark kicked Dean out, and that was in mid-August. So then Dean moved in with Patty Rosado. He left a lot of his belongings in Mark's garage for storage, and after Dean was out, Mark decided to spend some time in his garage trying to reorganize things. It was a real mess. And while he was doing that, he ran across a suitcase, and something was moving around inside of it. So he opened it, and he found inside a woman's purse with an address book, some tampons, some credit cards, and a driver's license belonging to Maria Cruz.
Yeah, but he wouldn't have any reason to know who Maria Cruz was.
No, but it's weird. Why would Dean have a woman's purse?
True. So what he did, which I'm not sure this is real helpful, but he tried calling random numbers from the address book.
Oh, I think that's the smart thing to do, because they're in her book. They should know who she is, so he could get the purse back to her. What else are you going to do? Unless you take it to the police.
Take it to the police?
Sure. But I think he was trying to help.
Okay. I would have taken it to the police.
Sure.
What he did in terms of calling people didn't really work. 2 people didn't answer. A third person told him he had the wrong number. So he decided, well, I don't know why Dean had the purse, but I don't want to know.
Yeah, which I kind of think he was still kind of covering for Dean.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
In my mind.
Yeah. But, he didn't think of murder. He assumed that Dean may have been committing credit card fraud, and he just decided to stay out of it. He put the suitcase back on top of some boxes and didn't even ask Dean about it. He didn't even want to talk to Dean anymore.
I mean, by late August, even Patty had grown tired of Dean. Then he gets arrested for possession of cocaine, and she ended up bailing him out. But he ended up moving to a hotel room.
A motel room.
To a motel
Nothing
room.
as nice as a hotel room, because now he really has no money. He's really just reaching the bottom of the barrel. He had a court date for his sentencing on September 5th, but he didn't show up. The Attorney General threatened to revoke his plea agreement, which I think is very fair. On September 10th, Dean emptied out his safety deposit box, which he had filled with cash, And 2 weeks passed, and Mark found a voicemail on his phone that had been left for Dean. This was a call from an airline confirming his reservation for a one-way flight to Costa Rica. So Dean had taken the flight with a 3-month visa.
Now Greg was receiving calls from Patty and the bail bonds company. Bail company obviously is looking for Dean and told Greg that if Dean didn't show up for his next court appearance, Greg was responsible for paying the rest of the money. Because remember, he's the one that had bailed him out.
Yeah, Dean had just fucked over Greg again, leaving him to pay more money. And apparently, Dean had had sex with Patty to kind of keep her on his side. So he had kind of turned Patty and Mark against Greg, and the manipulations were just crazy. But once in Costa Rica, Dean found it pretty easy to get drugs, and he quickly became part of the gay party scene there. Now he had $200,000 in cash. He didn't bother paying Greg or anything, so he was partying every night all night, just not caring about all the mess he'd left behind. What about Maria's family, who's looking for her and suffering?
Well, yeah. Greg told a journalist from Vanity Fair named Brian Burrow that one of Dean's favorite movies was Catch Me If You Can. And Greg wasn't surprised that Dean had fled, even though it did seem odd to leave the country over a 6-month jail term. Now, Greg had no way to find Dean, but by this point he's really angry that he had been left holding the bag again. His finances had taken a huge hit by Dean's actions over the years.
Yeah, so Greg ended up calling one of the Attorney General's investigators. This was Brian Ford. And Ford said he couldn't understand why Dean would have left the country, because he wasn't looking at that much jail time. So he asked Greg if he had any idea. And as they talked, Ford told Greg that he wanted to question Dean about a missing person. Maybe that's why he'd left. The police had found an email that had been sent to Dean in Maria's computer, scheduling an appointment for the day she disappeared. So this struck Greg as he remembered a conversation with Dean that Dean's accountant had told him about. According to the accountant friend, Dean had called him in a panic in April, saying that one of his patients had seized in a bad reaction to a lidocaine injection. Dean had told him that the patient recovered and he took her to the St. Vincent Hospital ER. So this interested Ford, of course, and he and Greg made plans to speak in person.
Yeah, so Greg's thinking about this disappearance and this medical emergency, and he began wondering and thinking, could Dean have killed the woman? He went back to the accountant and asked more questions, and this time the accountant told Greg that Dean had claimed that the patient had no vital signs during the call. Now this bit of information changed things, and this kind of convinced Greg that Dean could maybe actually have killed somebody.
Right, so apparently Dean had said more to the accountant because, he knew the doctor would freak out if he told him all that information, right?
Right.
So with the doctor, he had just pretended this was a friend he was calling about. But he had told the accountant that he'd given the person lidocaine and that she'd had no vital signs. So when Greg heard this, I'm sure he was alarmed. Then over the next few days, Greg was thinking about it. He kept thinking back to Dean's odd behavior with the concrete. And he talked these events over with the girl he was working with, and it all was starting to make sense as he talked through it. And after he had told her his entire story, she began to cry. And that's when Greg said he realized that Dean probably had killed Maria Cruz. So he looked through his planner to figure out the date and figured out it was April 13th when he had called the accountant about the medical emergency. And of course, this was just a short time before the whole concrete incident. Dean had another court appearance for October 8th, and of course he didn't show. His attorney admitted to the judge that she didn't know where he was. And the court forfeited his bail, so Greg was sent a bill for $6,000, and Dean was now a fugitive from justice. There was a warrant out for his arrest.
Now, by all accounts, Dean partied through the Christmas holiday in San Jose. Now, the Cruz family, who had always celebrated Christmas together as a family, just went through the motions. If Maria had lived, she would have been in the Philippines with her family. And without her, there's an incredible sadness about the family. And this was even made worse by the fact that they had absolutely no idea what had happened to her.
Yeah, but finally the cases of fugitive Dean Faiello and missing person Marie Cruz became one investigation. In February, homicide detectives followed up on a letter written by Greg and checked out the house on Elwood Avenue. The owners gave consent for the carriage house to be searched. The initial search seemed to confirm Greg's suspicions. In the back of the garage area, they found a hand-troweled rough slab of concrete, and the New Jersey court authorized a search warrant for the property. The NYPD worked along with the Newark PD, and they even brought in the New Jersey troopers. A team of detectives and forensics people entered the property and worked at tearing apart that concrete slab. As soon as they broke into the cement, the odor was horrendous, and they knew what they were dealing with. Within 2 hours, they had found the suitcase wrapped in trash bags, with Maria's body decomposing inside of it, and she'd been missing for 10 months now. So many people, of course, including Dr. Polis and the journalist Barbara Nevins Taylor, were just shocked by this news. They'd believed that his arrest would have stopped him from seeing clients and performing dangerous procedures, but somehow he had been able to continue. So many people spoke out about the failure of the authorities to stop him and protect the public. It was a big failure.
Yeah, a lot of these things happen after the fact. There's some horrible thing, like this guy's turned into a rabbit, and they're thinking that he should have been dealt with differently, and it's the same as kids that are abused, and social workers make multiple visits, and nothing ever gets done until the child gets killed.
Sure.
And there's analogy and analogy and analogy. A lot of times, if you feel kind of cynical and stuff, you figure nothing happens until a horrendous event happens, and then things might get fixed a little bit.
That's true.
At least temporarily.
Right, but I mean, you really have to think it's really down to you to protect yourself, unfortunately.
Yeah,
you have to research these people, which it really shouldn't be that way. He shouldn't have been allowed to run these ads and do this, but especially after the arrest, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But he did.
And you don't have enough staff or enough people to monitor things that carefully, so you can get away with it again for a while.
Well, that's another thing. So thankfully, the journalists did help out in that regard.
Yeah.
But Dean had sent several emails to friends, which were traced back to Costa Rica. And Mark Ritchie was able to confirm that Dean had taken a flight there in September. The New York Post reporter, Jean McIntosh, flew to Costa Rica, and she was able to find the internet cafe where he had sent the emails. She showed his photo at various nightclubs, and he was recognized by many people. He was actually living at this time in a beach resort about 100 miles outside of San Jose. At a resort, relaxing by the pool and drinking.
Life is good. Now, even though Greg had been the person that notified the authorities of his suspicions about Dean, the police weren't very kind to him. He was treated as if he had advanced knowledge of Maria's death. Now, her body did eventually get identified by the serial number on her breast implants and by dental records.
Yeah, so I just really feel for Greg in this whole situation.
Yeah, he's getting screwed over again.
Every direction he turns,
yeah.
Right?
Does no good deed go unpunished? I mean, God.
Yeah, right. Dean's sister Deborah was questioned about how much she knew, and we don't know if she was aware. But we do know that she knew Dean was breaking the law by performing these medical treatments, and she also knew that he was forging prescriptions to support his drug addiction. And she was also aware of where he had fled to. She had actually convinced his attorney to send money to him in Costa Rica before his arrest warrant was issued in October. So after Maria's body was found in Dean's old house, his attorney called the DA and told them about these funds that he had wired to Costa Rica, not knowing that he was a fugitive and wanted to be questioned at least about a murder.
Dean was arrested in Costa Rica for jumping bail. So this was enough to apply for extradition until Maria's autopsy gets completed and they could identify a cause of death. Meanwhile, the apartment on 16th Street where Dean was practicing his latest career got searched. They found a laser machine, syringes, and medications in this apartment.
Yeah, so on February 26th, about a week after Maria's body was found, Dean was arrested for second-degree murder. So he was still in Costa Rica and he fought extradition for 8 months, but he was finally brought to New York for his arraignment in 2005. And that 8 months in the Costa Rican jail did not do him any good. He looked terrible. Of course, he hadn't had his HIV meds, and you don't get much to eat in those jails, so people wondered why he wanted to stay there. Maybe he was embarrassed to return to the U.S., but he really didn't want to return to the U.S., even though the conditions there were better.
Yeah, but I guess he doesn't know what they're going to charge him with, really. I mean, is it first-degree murder, second-degree murder, assault? And the sentencing can vary. So maybe he figured he'd be more happy in Costa Rica.
I guess so.
But he got extradited, finally. Then in October 2006, he pled guilty to first-degree assault and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in a couple years, 2022. So that'll be 16 years that he'll have served if he gets parole.
Well, I feel like he got off easy with this first-degree assault plea.
Well, yeah.
Yeah. And he was a total narcissist who put his needs above the life of an innocent woman. I mean, plus, I know this isn't illegal, I guess, but he really treated his lovers and friends and family members like shit. It was just all about what they could do for him. So the lesson here for me, I guess, is just to be careful who you trust. You may not think it's a big deal to have some small cosmetic procedure, but you need to check into any provider you're making an appointment with for sure.
Well, yeah, absolutely. We've gone over this. We've done enough doctor cases to recognize what you need to do before you let any doctor do things to you.
Well, but he wasn't even a doctor.
Well, he wasn't. But when he was asked if he was, he said yes.
Right.
So he presented himself that way. He might not have gone around proclaiming that he was a doctor, but he agreed with people or said, yeah, I am, when they asked him.
So it's interesting that there were several actual physicians who were practicing illegally and dangerously too. And this case also points out to me how substance abuse can change a person and just send you down a terrible path. I mean, I think with Dean, he was actually a narcissist, from a young age, and then his drug addiction just made him more and more dangerous.
Prior to her interactions with Dean Faiello, Maria had had some facial surgery and some breast implants successfully done, and her family said that she had researched her plastic surgeon. So she did due diligence on those procedures, the facelift or facial surgery and breast implantation. But for some reason, she didn't research Dean. Maybe that's because the procedure seems so minor.
That's all I can think, yeah.
Although I'd be of the opinion there isn't any procedure that's so minor that you don't check.
Sure, especially if someone's injecting a drug into you.
Yeah, but there were definitely some red flags about Dean. One was where his office or where his practice was, in an apartment.
Yeah.
In one room in the apartment. And then the other thing was that he asked her to bring cash. There's no mention of an insurance claim or anything like that.
No, he couldn't bill insurance. This was all cash.
Right, so...
But insurance probably wouldn't pay for that anyway, I don't think.
I don't know.
Maybe.
I think he could word it in a way.
Plus, she was making good money. She thought she was doing something nice for herself here. But it's just, if you're going to an apartment and paying cash, I just hope that people will think about that, because that's not normal.
No.
Now, according to author Diane Fanning, the New York DA's office found 580 cases of fake doctors practicing medicine over a 4-year period, and it became so common in Florida that they created an unlicensed activity office. In 2003, they investigated over 700 complaints and convicted over 100 practitioners.
Well, come enjoy the Florida sunshine.
Yeah.
And practice medicine that you're not licensed for.
Well, any kind of scams takes advantage of the elderly, and there's a large elderly population in Florida.
Sure.
According to Dean's ex-lover Greg Bach, Dean's motivation was mostly his insatiable hunger for drugs. And he even said that he believes that in Dean's mind, he was actually seeing himself as Dr. Faiello. He really enjoyed the power as much as the money. So bless that Greg Bach, huh? He just went through a bad experience here. I hope he found somebody nice now. Someone who'll treat him nicely.
Yeah, we should follow up on that.
Well, he's not exactly ugly either. He's a handsome man. And much kinder, for sure.
He seems to be.
Yeah. So our sources for this case are Under the Knife, which is a book by Diane Fanning. Vanity Fair had a featured article, Nightmare on Elwood Avenue, in June of 2004, written by Brian Burrow. Vanity Fair Confidential, the TV show, Season 2, Episode 1, was based on that article. It's titled Nightmare on Elwood Avenue. I really enjoyed that episode, although I generally enjoy the Vanity Fair Confidential show. Well done. Of course, we also went through the New York Post archives. So thank you to those sources. And also thank you to Tristan Capel, who wrote and produced our music. So we're having some very short housekeeping reminders today. We said some things earlier. Just remember, if you do want to support the show and become a tie grabber for as little as $4 a month, go to tiegrabber.com and click on subscribe. And like I said earlier, what we're trying out now is making every weekly episode in an ad-free version for our members. Now, unfortunately, I can't go back and do that with all our episodes. We have 300 episodes, so I just don't have the hosting space or the time to do that. But from here on out, I'm going to make a members-only version where the ads are plucked out for our members. So I hope that gives you a little something extra because we do appreciate your support. And a little reminder about the beer contest again, Dick.
The beer contest is over. You can certainly still send me reviews if you'd like. But the contest is done. The winner will be announced on the episode that we'll be putting out on May 19th.
And also a reminder that on our website, tiegrabber.com, we do have a shop where you can get pretty much anything you want with our logo on it. We have a few different logos and sayings. I think my favorite is the Meet Me at the Quiet End. You have a t-shirt with that.
It's a pretty cool shirt.
It's a cool shirt, yeah. So no feedback today. We've decided this is a long episode, and poor Dick's been busy listening to all your great beer reviews. But we'll be back with voicemails and emails next week. Just remember, if you have a case suggestion or comments about a crime or a beer, we encourage you to send us a voicemail. Or if you're too shy for that, just send us an email. And you can send that to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com.
Oh, fascinating episode.
Absolutely. So thank you everyone for listening, and take care of yourselves. Stay home if you can. And we'll see you next week at the Quiet End.
Be there. I still have plenty of this beer left over. We'll continue sipping.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
See you next week.